When the GR Corolla launched 3 years ago, I was intrigued, but I was also concerned because typically Toyota leaves a product unchanged for 4 to 5 years, then they give it a visual refresh, but not a mechanical upgrade, then it lasts for another 3 to 4 years before it's finally replaced. But not so with the GR Corolla. In fact, this has received some relatively substantial engineering upgrades every year since its introduction, culminating now with the 2026 GR Corolla. Let's talk about what's changed in that time and why I think this is the best hot hatch in North America right now. Right off the bat, there are three main reasons to choose the GR Corolla over some of the competition. The first is its price tag. At $41,115, including destination, this is likely going to cost you a lot less than a Civic Type R, which still sells at a premium, and the GR Corolla, you can find these at MSRP all across the country. The other reason? All-wheel drive. We don't find that at all in the Civic Type R. And the third is, of course, Toyota reliability and dependability, something that definitely separates this from the Volkswagen Golf R, and part of that is that you can actually get this with an 8-speed automatic, and it's a real, regular automatic, not a dual clutch, something you don't find in the Civic Type R, and in the Golf R, the DCT is a lot of fun, but it's not as daily driver livable as this very red hatch next to me. Visually, not too much has changed since 2023. We find a slightly different grille insert, but mostly what we see are more standard features, some changes under the skin, and a rebundling of the options packages. The carbon fiber roof is back. It's in the top trim. There are only 2 trims, but the base version doesn't get that. The upper level trim does. All models are going to get the hood vents, and importantly, all models are going to get the changes under the skin that I think are even more critical. The limited slip front differential and rear differential, which are quite unique in this segment, are both standard. This all-wheel drive system can also send 70% of its power to the rear axle, giving it a very different driving dynamic than a Civic Type R. We then get improved cooling, improved suspension components, new dampers, new springs, new suspension arms, etc. versus 2023. Now, I will caution you in this video that we're going to be treating 2026 as if it is a change directly from 2023. That is not actually the case. Toyota has actually made incremental changes every year since this actually launched. But in this video, we're mainly going to be referencing the original GR Corolla and how it has updated now to 2026. Once upon a time, there were a ton of hot hatch options to choose from, but today in the United States, we have just 3 in my opinion. We have this, we have the Golf R, and we have the Civic Type R. 2 of them offer all-wheel drive, this and the Golf R. One of them is front-wheel drive only, that Civic Type R, because the WRX, it is sedan only for this generation. And there is an argument to be made that the Civic Type R back here is more sedan than it is hatchback. I think the most generous we could be is sportback or liftback, but the format is generally more similar to what we find in the Corolla sedan than in the Corolla hatchback. And there are certainly pros and cons to that. The much longer dimensions that we find in that Civic mean that it has a more comfortable back seat. It actually has a more practical cargo area behind that back seat as well. But the larger dimensions definitely make it feel bigger out on the road, and this feels a lot more sporty. Of course, we get GR brakes up front, slotted rotors. These are Michelin Pilot Sport 5s in a 235/40 ZR18, so not quite as low profile as you might suspect. The GR Corolla also has a surprising amount of personality. Clearly, some parts are shared with the regular Corolla hatch, but then they're combined with these bulging fender flares, which really gives us a dramatic look from this angle. And of course, the signature 3-outlet exhaust, 1 for each cylinder. When designing this drivetrain, the engineers really pulled out all the stops. The engine is unique. It's a 1.6-liter turbocharged 3-cylinder, producing 300 horsepower and now 295 pound-feet of torque. That's definitely a bump over last year's 1.6. We have improved cooling for the engine and a second air intake to help get those torque figure numbers, and also some revised engine programming as well. The engine is mated to your choice of a 6-speed manual or an 8-speed automatic. And that 8-speed automatic is controversial, but it is an important distinction between this and certainly the Civic Type R, which doesn't have an automatic at all, and the Golf R, which uses a dual clutch transmission. This transmission is likely going to be more reliable and less expensive to keep around than a DCT. It also gives you better daily driver performance. As much as I love a manual transmission, I have to admit, if I were buying a car as a daily driver, I probably would get the automatic transmission. If I were buying it as a weekend car or a second car, I'd get the manual every day. The other thing that's different is we have a limited slip differential up front and a limited slip differential in the rear that are now standard. You don't have to choose an option box for those. And this can choose to send 70% of engine power to the rear because the rear axle is actually overdriven versus the front. That sounds very similar to what we find in Acura's super handling all-wheel drive system, because it is what's happening in Acura's super handling all-wheel drive system. The key difference is we don't have a rear differential that's as bulky and as heavy as we find in Acura's system, and we have a limited slip differential there instead of a twin clutch unit in the back. On the inside, nothing has changed versus the last time we saw the GR Corolla. So since we don't have too much time with this model, I'll let you reference that video if you have any more in-depth questions. The infotainment system is still a little on the small side. I would have loved to have seen a larger screen grafted into the dashboard, say like we find in the Corolla Cross. Down here we find dual zone automatic climate controls. We still find a wireless charging mat down there. It is relatively small, it's also difficult to see there. We find red stitching here, pretty traditional shifter. This one has the automatic transmission, which is certainly not as engaging as the manual. I'll be driving the manual out on the track, but I think is really quite practical. Here we have the drive mode selector, and that allows us a decent amount of variation for not just the engine tuning, but also the GR4 all-wheel drive system tuning. On the dashboard, the design is very much like the rest of the Corolla lineup. We have soft touch materials there, rubbery plastics up on top. We have a different steering wheel here than we find in the rest of the Corolla lineup. Paddle shifters on the back because this has the automatic transmission. There are controls for the multifunction instrument cluster over there and controls for the adaptive cruise control system right there on that side standard as well. One thing I've always been a little bit sad about is this little piece of plastic over here on the driver's side, because on the passenger side it's a soft touch material. Here it's a scratchy hard plastic, but we do have soft touch materials on the doors. As far as the seats go, I do find these more comfortable than average for a sport vehicle. We have the GR logo there. These look like they might be a 5-point harness capable seat, but they are not from the factory. You would have to swap out the seats. It says kind of a leatherette and faux suede insert going on there. It is a completely manual seat design with pretty aggressive bolstering, but room-wise, here's why you might want to choose something else, because as you can see, there's not a lot of room between that front seat and the rear seat if I'm sitting up front. And if you're taller than I am, the rear seat's practically going to be useless. The cargo area is also not terribly large, and for a hatchback, it's not very square either. So you will find a more practical cargo area in the Golf, I think, and in the Civic Type R as well. This cargo area is somewhat pyramid shaped, as you can see right there. So some of those larger and boxier items would have trouble fitting in here, but they definitely fit in the Golf. Alrighty, let's get the GR Corolla out on the track. We are starting in a 2023 because thankfully, Toyota has actually decided to bring along all three major revisions of the hardware on the GR Corolla so we can really see the difference between the model years. Now, consistently, 0 to 60 times are going to be best in the automatic transmission version of the GR Corolla. If it doesn't seem like I'm going too fast out on the track, there are a bunch of cones, and of course I'm trying to talk at the same time that I'm trying to drive this car around, so sorry about that, everybody. But basically, 0 to 60 times in the manual transmission version are going to be around 5.5 seconds for really good drivers, about 6 seconds for most drivers, because of course there is that clutch that you have to deal with there. The automatic transmission, 4.9 seconds pretty much every single time. That's not just because it's automatically shifting the gears for you, it's because it actually has some lower gear ratios as well. When you take a look at the ratio spread in that 8-speed automatic, it's actually pretty advantageous. It has some lower gear ratios than we find in the manual and ratios that are closer together, really improving that 0 to 60 performance in that vehicle. Now out here at Sonoma Raceway, I'm kind of sad that they have all the cones everywhere, because most manufacturers that bring us to Sonoma Raceway let us play on this track without the cones. Now, right now, we are in the track mode here. So for this generation, that's power split 50-50 front rear. That's a pretty neutral feel here in the GR Corolla. And it's one thing that I've always liked about this all-wheel drive system is the way that you can dial it up. Kind of like, I don't know, Mitsubishi's from the 1990s, etc. I love that ability in this system. That's all made possible by the fact that the rear axle is being overdriven versus the front. Again, like Acura's super handling all-wheel drive system. In an all-wheel drive system like this, that's really the only way you can send more power to the rear than the front, is by making those rear wheels spin a little bit faster. Now, the front wheels can't be disconnected. They're always going to be connected. It can just connect the rears, make them spin faster. I've now hopped into the 2024 GR Corolla. I'm really happy that Toyota has provided the 23, the 24, and the 26 so we can test these back to back, because some of the changes they made seem subtle. We'll see if they all collect together here. Not only have they improved the structural rigidity of the vehicle, that's the major change for 26, a lot more structural adhesive, And structural adhesive is important because it helps the unibody keep from flexing quite as much out on the track. But over the years, they have also changed things like some of the attachment bolts for the suspension components, engine cradle, etc. Decent number of changes there. Some of those happened in 24. The complete package is now done in 26. They've also tweaked the GR4 system programming as well. Not too much of a difference here, but I will say that when you are willing to push this out on a track, that's when you're going to notice the difference between this and some of the all-wheel drive systems in this segment, even something like a Subaru WRX. Now, the WRX is a little interesting because it's a longitudinal vehicle, but its drivetrain actually sends only 55% of the power to the rear axle at most, and that's only if you choose the CVT, or sorry, Subaru Performance transmission, which is a CVT. This one, of course, again, if you choose the automatic, it's a regular 8-speed. But importantly, it doesn't matter which transmission you choose, this can send more power to the rear axle. And in corners like this, you will feel it. You can actually get the vehicle to rotate just a little bit with your right foot. Now, it's never going to be a Ford Mustang or a Chevy Camaro or anything like that. It's never going to get tail happy, but it is going to be that next level of fun, that next level of engagement versus the average all-wheel drive option in this segment. It's also going to be just so predictable and easy to drive. That's the best thing about this. And the big reason you might want to choose all-wheel drive in your next performance vehicle like this, it really makes you feel like a rock star compared to the amount of attention you have to put on a two-wheel drive option, whether you're talking about something like a GR86 or even that Civic Type R. And finally, now we are in the 2026. You know, the differences, they're not night and day. I'd say that they're subtle, but one of the nice things is that aside from the additional adhesive that they use on the unibody of this vehicle, pretty much every other change could actually be bolted on to a 23 or a 24 GR Corolla, or, 25 as well. So it is nice that they didn't make changes that were so different that they couldn't be added to the existing vehicles. And apparently that was not an accident. Toyota said that they were very deliberate in their changes, that they wanted you to be able to modify your existing models and have them have a lifetime longer than simply a year or two. One thing you'll definitely notice out on this track is the manual transmission. I'd say it's more refined than the manual that we find in the WRX. That is a tiny bit tractory on occasion, but it doesn't have quite the slick engagement that we find in some Volkswagen manuals or, of course, the Civic Type R's manual transmission. I think Honda has a really excellent feel with that manual transmission shifter, but Toyota's gotten pretty close. And their intelligent variable manual transmission technology helps you feel kind of like a rock star, not to mention that extra torque in the back. You can really tell on this torque display here when the system is sending more power to the rear. And of course, you can feel it in the steering wheel, and you can also feel it in your seat. The way that this powers around these corners, you're doing a little bit of understeer, you put a little bit of power into it, you get a little bit of oversteer. Of course, you get that throttle lift oversteer as well. It's just a really fun, very engaging package. I think Toyota really did a slam dunk with this. I am super curious to see what the Yaris would be like, because of course we don't get the GR Yaris in America. The Yaris is, of course, unlikely to ever return to the United States, and that's a little bit sad because it is the smallest interpretation of the GR family, and I'd be really excited to see what that is like out on the road. Hopefully one day I have the opportunity to drive it, but that's not today. The benefit of something like this over a GR86, etc., is simply the volume of production of the base vehicle, the donor vehicle, if you like. Toyota produces so many Corollas, so many Corolla hatchbacks and sedans around the world that it helps lower the cost of everything in here. That's part of the reason that the GR family is this sort of mainstream, affordable fun in a way that we don't find that much in the United States anymore. This is, for me, perhaps the last true hot hatch, because something like a Golf R, the market's just getting so limited now that it's had to become more expensive in order to stay in the United States. We don't find the regular Golf anymore, and for this, you can actually still buy the regular model without the GR bits. The GR Corolla is a ton of fantastic, but should you get it over the competition? That is a little bit tricky depending on what you like. I like all-wheel drive, but I know a decent number of hot hatch fans that think all-wheel drive vehicles like this are sort of cheating, that a real hot hatch needs to be front-wheel drive, like a Volkswagen Golf GTI or the Civic Type R, not like the Golf R. I, on the other hand, disagree. I think all-wheel drive is actually the way to go, because by the time you get to 300 horsepower or beyond, like we expect to see in the Volkswagen Golf R, you really need all-wheel drive to be able to harness it. If you have never driven a Civic Type R in the rain or in the cold, let alone the snow or any other adverse conditions, you will know that the front wheels are very easily overwhelmed by the massive amount of power you can get out of that engine. Then there's also the reality that the automatic transmission is fantastic. And for most folks, this is going to be quicker 0 to 60 than the manual, unless you're really willing to roast that clutch. Then we have the reality also that a regular automatic transmission is just easier to live with than the Volkswagen Golf R's DCT, which tends to roll a bit more. It's not going to be as smooth in stop and go traffic. And again, if this is going to be your daily driver, I would lean towards the automatic transmission. The Golf R, though, it has a significantly more premium interior. We also find more rear seat room, really, in the Golf R or the Civic Type R especially. And the Civic Type R has a bit more of a grown-up feel. Now, I don't know if grown-up feel is necessarily a significant advantage for that Civic Type R, because there is something to be said for the amount of playful fun that you can have in the GR Corolla. And the fact that it doesn't come across quite as polished or quite as smooth in some ways as the Civic Type R can. The manual transmission, I don't think it's quite as nice, quite as notchy as what we find in some of the Germans or in the Honda lineup, but that adds to the personality of the GR Corolla. Let me know what you think about that down there in the comments section below. And finally, again, there is the price tag, which I think is Goldilocks just right here. It's really in the same ballpark as significantly less powerful vehicles out there that are going to be less fun. And for some reason, we do not see the same kind of dealer markups on GR Corollas generally that we still see on average in the Civic Type R. In fact, last year we kind of looked at a GR Corolla. We had dealers saying absolutely no problem, they'd sell us one at MSRP. So if you hunt around, you can definitely find them. As always, let us know what you think about all that down there in the comment section below. If you haven't found our podcast, be sure and check that out. You'll find that on YouTube and your favorite podcast platform. And of course, find us over at Facebook as well. See all of you later.